Good afternoon, everyone. I want to repeat what many of us are saying here, how exciting and exhilarating this conference is. It's really an honor to be part of it. I thank everyone who's been involved, both the organizers and the participants. I know this may seem a little bit unorthodox, but I'd like to dedicate my talk to Joanne Ruvoli, who was a colleague who recently died just last month. Joanne was a scholar of Italian-American women's literature, as well as many other topics, and the review editor for the Italian-American Review for Film and New Media. So, without further ado, I should say that this article is a shortened version of a much larger article from a 2-volume anthology called New Italian Migrations to the United States that I co-edited with Laura Roberto. And of course, being here in Australia, it's where much of the immigration came in the post-war era. That post-war era also happened in the United States to a much significant lesser degree, but one that happened nonetheless. So, with that, let me begin. In 1955, my paternal grandmother, Filomena, sent a message from Caruncchio, an Abruzzese town in the Apennines, to her only son, Enrico, and his wife, Anna, in Manhattan's Washington Heights neighborhood. My father had left Italy 3 years earlier in search of work, and in New York City met his future bride, who too had sailed across the Atlantic in 1950. Enrico and Anna married in 1954 and had me, their first child, the following year. In her message, my grandmother rebuked the young couple who, with their new responsibilities, were not making the time to communicate regularly, in her opinion, and expressed her anguish at their collective transgression. This impassioned admonishment did not come in the form of a letter, a telegram, or a telephone call, but was instead broadcast on a New York City radio station for millions of potential listeners to hear. My grandmother's pleading voice, recorded in Italy and aired in the United States, was the product of a unique commercial radio program that linked Italian-American families with their relatives in Italy during the post-World War II era.
Come mai questo silenzio? Perché non mi scrivete? Non sapete che io soffro molto? Maggiormente adesso Anna, che ha portato a luce il piccolo Gioso. Ricordatevi che avete solo la madre e che ha sofferto molto. Io ricordo che durante il tempo del vostro fidanzamento ricevete una lettera alla settimana e adesso perché siete così trascurati?
And so I'm going to be providing you here with the English translations of some of these recordings. Filomena SCIORRA's message is found on one of 6 unlabeled and undated 10-inch 78 RPM acetate records from my parents' personal collection, made in my approximation between 1952 and 1955. They are the product of La Grande Famiglia, the Big Family, a 15-minute radio show that aired from 1948 to 1961 on WOV-AM, a New York City station with extensive Italian language programming. La Grande Famiglia was an ingenious marketing campaign devised for the Italian-American food company, Progresso Italian Food Corporation, that would, with proof of purchase for products, have a Rome-based representative drive to Italian-Americans' hometowns to record mundane family news, chastisements and pleas, and heartfelt expressions of love and longing. These affectionate, joyful, desperate, and sometimes pained messages from afar were in turn broadcast twice daily for all to hear. Given WOV's extensive syndicated network, La Grande Famiglia was also heard in New Britain, Connecticut, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Miami, Florida, and Pasadena, California, basically across the country. After airing the messages, representatives of the program mailed a 78 RPM recording of the broadcasted message. In the course of a decade, it was reported that 500,000 families in the United States had participated in this unique transnational communication project. And when I began to study in 2000, I was the only person I knew that had these recordings. Over the course of now almost 20 years, and with the publication of this article, people are beginning to send me these digitized recordings that they have. And that's really exciting to start to listen to those and make comparisons. And here I just want to give you just a kind of family chart. This is on the top my where my mother's family and on the bottom, my father's family. These are people who are speaking and who they are speaking about. Just to kind of give you a sense of the range of folks involved. La Grande Famiglia emerged out of a history of Italian migration in the 20th century that encompassed both pre- and post-World War II Italian waves. These broadcasts were aimed at immigrants who arrived before and after 1945, and thus created continuity between members of these migration streams. It sonically reunited families that had been apart for a few years, as well as those who have been separated for decades. And I won't be talking about it today, but one of the things that I do is trace the migration histories of these two families, some of them going back to the right after Italian unification, and including return immigration to Italy, Argentina, and the United States. But I do that in the article to give some kind of context to these recordings. The program's success was predicated on the historical separation of family members and their continued desire to communicate about their physical, economic, and emotional states. La Grande Famiglia was part of a continuum of what Sonia Kansian calls the transnationality of communication and migration processes that spanned first letters and telegrams, then telephones, and eventually the internet. In this case, radio played a pivotal role in connecting individuals through the maintenance and reproduction of affiliations and emotional bonds. The messages recorded in Italian villages, towns, and cities, broadcast in the United States, were examples of what Loretta Baldassar and Donna Gabaccia referred to as intimacies across borders. The radio program facilitated and became integrated into the work of maintaining continued connections and effective associations between family members separated by distance. And picking up on Loretta's wonderful keynote the other day, we could talk about this as mediated kinning maintenance. The soundscape of local community-based intimacy that we hear in the recordings of La Grande Famiglia was not confined to a group of Italians in one U.S. locale, but instead was part of a transnational sphere connecting various sites in Italy and the United States, thus contributing to the maintenance of what Barry Trouks calls an acoustic community, that is family and strangers alike who are linked and defined by sounds. And this is an ad from a U.S. radio trade magazine advertising WOV. Recent literature on current means of communication, the internet, satellite dishes, etc., explore how they aid, advance, and contribute to cultural identities in diasporic formations. My talk today, on the other hand, seeks to uncover and examine an earlier manifestation of transnational mediated communication and the strengthening of diasporic identities, specifically among Italians. By examining the recorded messages, textual content, I seek to reveal the ways in which intimacy for these individuals was created, reestablished, and maintained sonically across the geographic divide that separated families on both sides of the Atlantic. A brief history of the program, the radio station, just to give you a sense of how this program came about. WOV was founded in 1928, and by focusing on what was called a single market of Italian speakers, WOV would come to have the city's most extensive Italian schedule by the mid-1930s. It became a hub for the International Broadcasting Corporation, a far-reaching network of stations featuring Italian language programs across the US. By the mid-1950s, it billed itself as La Voce Italiana d'America. WOV took a bold step in 1946 when it established a studio with a full-time staff in Rome, the only non-English language commercial station in the country to have a foreign facility. 2 years later, WOV's Rome studio became the production site for La Grande Famiglia, and within 5 years, it had become one of the most successful programs in the station's lineup, with WOV branding itself as La Stazione della Grande Famiglia. This is as it says on the bottom, WOV listeners visiting the station, and the woman at the far end of the table is my mom, Anna. And I think it's interesting because she was the person who initiated this whole process of buying the food goods, sending it away, and maintaining those relationships of what Michele Di Leonardo calls the work of kinship. The mail discs solidified the emotional power of the entire campaign, reinforcing and amplifying sonically Italian diasporic sentiment and affiliation long after the voices had been originally aired. The profound expressivity of these messages was something that one journalist noted at the time. The broadcasts are chocked with unbridled emotion. Many individuals who were recorded had not seen or heard their relatives in decades. My father noted that there were no home telephones in small towns like his during the 1950s, and consequently the recorded voices had all that much more emotional import. In this set, so now I'm going to talk about the messages and some of the content. In this set of recordings, all but one of those speaking in Italian does so in standard Italian, albeit with regional accents and pronunciations. But perhaps the most telling accented language is that of Anna's father, Emilio. Having worked in the United States before World War II, Emilio speaks in English, but with an accent and syntax of an Italian immigrant from the 1930s.
I'm your father's personality. I like to have you and all your, you and your brothers and sister-in-laws to be all together, and that not to be so rusty. Rusty will be, worst will come to you. Always happy.
Announcer Giuliano Gerbi's bilingualism and accented English are also a noted linguistic element found at the beginning and closing of the recording.
And now the usual intermission, a very short intermission for the commercial. Rimanete in ascolto, riprenderò subito dopo dall'Italia. Intesi? Go ahead, New York.
The multilingual voices, standard Italian, regional accents, dialect, and varieties of English heard during these transmissions are an oral testament to Italian immigration stories. And this is Giuliano Gerbi recording some people, we don't know where, we don't know when, sometime in, I'm assuming in the 1950s. The messages of La Grande Famiglia, although directed to particular individuals, were never private ones, but public in various ways. First and foremost, they spoke their words in front of, and to a large degree, to Gerbi. He influenced, supervised, and managed their mediated presentations at the time of the recording, and later during the editing process, which I'll talk a little bit about later. In addition, they spoke their heart's desires in the company of other family members who heard what they were saying, and as a result, were to some degree circumscribed by what they could publicly state. Speaking in 2001 while listening to the 1955 recording, Enrico maintained that his mother was not forthcoming about her reasons for not honoring his request to visit him in New York City. With half a century of hindsight, he told me that Filomena did not want to say in front of her daughter that she was unable to come to the United States because she was responsible for taking care of her granddaughter while the parents worked during the day. In at least one case, the setting for the recording was a post office. Who else in this most public space heard Anna's father say that his estranged wife had called the police on him? How would this specific performance, an intimate yet public voicing, have played out afterwards in the everyday lives of townspeople? These recordings have a direct relationship to letters, written, received, or lacking, with references to mail private correspondence a repeated motif. In one case, Anna sent a letter along with her proof of purchase, asking that it be read to her father in Italy, and Gerbi complies by incorporating it into the recording session. Many of the comments people make are in the form of questions that can only have been answered with a letter. The frequency or lack thereof of Italian writing is an important topic in the recorded messages. These discussions are, for the most part, recriminations about the intended listeners not writing enough or not writing at all, coupled with the misery that lack of attention and familial duty produces, as we heard at the beginning with Filomena's message. These messages articulate a burning desire to be emotionally connected across the distance. In addition, the importance in maintaining a transatlantic connection was imperative for those in Italy, given the economic benefits migration ideally provided for those who remained behind. My parents, in fact, were sending remittances and medicine at that time. As Sonia Cancian notes about the letters between Italian immigrants in Canada and their families in Italy, they were critical ways of placing emotional and social pressures on migrants and loved ones to stay the course. A major concern for migrant families in Italy was that of being forgotten. Enrico's cousin Olga reminds her relatives in the United States, "Don't forget that you have relatives here." A key rhetorical device and repeated theme, in particular from both parents, is the notion of suffering and conveying a depth of that emotional pain to their respective children in New York City. Both parents tie their woes to that of their individual offspring when they were children. In discussing problems with his second wife, Emilio references Anna and her siblings' troubles with their stepmother when they were living in Italy. In a similar vein, Filomena discusses her anguish at Enrico's departure and absence by bringing up her sadness when he was sent to boarding school after his father's death in 1936. The parents' suffering are at the heart of these messages. Emilio paints a particularly dire situation, mentioning the word suffering no less than 8 times regarding his predicament in 2 recordings. Perhaps his most forceful statement is the extreme one of, "I'm suffering all my sufferings." These tales of sorrow are coupled with accusation of filial negligence. He juxtaposes his troubles with his children's perceived easy and joyful life in the United States. In English, he said, "Well, yous go out for the pleasure in America, and I got all my suffering." Exposition of misery and emotional pain engendered by absence and longing, occasionally ending with a lump in the speaker's throat, or tears, are heard in these recordings. Emilio's distraught voice is perceptible in his closing comments on 2 different recordings. Filomena, on the other hand, breaks into tears, and Gerbi states that she's un po' commossa, illustrating how Gerbi works to heighten the emotional intensity in a choreographed manner. As Filomena chokes up, Gerbi prompts her to kiss her own hand, like that, so as to make audible the sound of a kiss to her son in New York City, which she does. And the interesting thing is I've heard another family's recording which he does the same thing to another family. So it's remarkable how he's actually, as I say, curating the emotions for the larger public. This example intimates that Gerbi's curating of emotions was central to the production of the recordings and the ultimate success of the program. In this mediated context, such sentiments and passions are given center stage. In addition to rebukes and the speaker's heightened emotional tenor, these recorded messages abound in articulations of love. We hear the recurrent salutation, affectionate greetings, kisses, hugs, and blessings sent across the airwaves to the United States. These wholehearted verbal declarations of deep affection close individual messages and serve as lasting reminders of bonds that united family members across the distance. The recordings are also filled with mundane messages about minor illnesses, as well as announcements pertaining to marriages and newborns. Enrico's cousin Italia announces her recent engagement, while her sister Olga gives the date of a pending wedding. The birth of Anna and Enrico's first son is noted in one recording, while the birth of a boy is made known by Anna's Aunt Lydia. Perhaps these messages were the latest news that had yet to be conveyed in a written letter. This is, I don't have a pointer here, but this is Filomena, this is Enrico, this is Anna, this is Joseph. Enrico's sister, Gloria, and her husband, and some other family members. Some of them who are also heard in these recordings. The recorded communiques were part of a chain of messages that included letters and eventually telephone calls about aspirations and desires to travel, to reunite, and be in each other's physical presence again. This theme of reuniting includes travel in both directions, as well as the possibility of future migrations, and further reminds us of the ongoing transnational movement between Italy and the United States. Filomena references Enrico and Anna's letter asking her to come to New York City. But it is Emilio who is actively seeking assistance from Anna and his other children for helping in remigrating to the United States. And he says, "I'm making my mind to try to draw some of my money. Maybe in a month or 2 or 3, I'll sail across." In the years following the last recording from 1955, family members were reunited through various visits to both sides of the Atlantic, as seen in this image here. So in conclusion, the transatlantic disembodied voices La Grande Famiglia listeners heard in New York City, and in Pittsburgh, in Miami, and in Pasadena were not only those of family members, but of similar Italian-American families with similar dilemmas, aches, dreams, and desires. Collectively, Italian-Americans' diasporic identities and conditions consisted of those who arrived both before and after World War II. The new Italian immigrants with their more immediate connections to Italy helped enhance the notion of Italian American that had fortified an acoustic community through the sound of spoken Italian. In addition, their growing presence and economic achievement and consumerism fortified the growth and success of WOV and its Italian language programming, as well as Progresso Foods and other Italian American-owned companies. This complicated and ever-changing history of Italian migration was conveyed through sentiment and sound. The cumulative effect of these multiple voices over the course of a dozen years created a concert of sorts, sometimes melodious, sometimes discordant, that expressed and conveyed acoustically a transnational intimacy shared among thousands upon thousands of other Italian Americans who are sonically united through their tears and laughter and love. Thank you.